A lot of students have questions about GPA and GRE, letters of recommendation, and what they should be doing to prepare for graduate school. Unfortunately, a lot of times these questions are coming up towards the end of their undergraduate career and their senior year as they're applying for graduate school. So if you're in that situation and you're a senior, the best thing that we can talk about here is just broadly how you can kind of focus on issues. The GPA is important. The higher your GPA, generally the better an applicant you are to a lot of graduate programs. But you can actually look at your GPA and present it in ways that may make you look more favorable. If, for instance, your GPA psychology specific, and you may have to hand calculate this, calculating your GPA in every psych class you took may be a higher GPA than your overall GPA. And if it is, it may be worth reporting. You may also have done very well in advanced psychology classes once you became more interested in the subject, including maybe statistical classes or research method classes. Again, you might not necessarily report an average GPA of only 2 or 3 classes, but you may report that you've got an A in very hard or graduate type classes, such as upper level research methods classes or 400 level psychology classes. The GRE is also important in most graduate programs, and we'll talk a little bit about what you're looking for and what programs are looking for in the GRE. Just know that a very good score on the GRE is a help. Without a question, you have more options before you and you are a better applicant for a lot more programs. But don't let a low GRE, especially if it's the only major hiccup in your application, stop you from pursuing your goals, your career, and your hope of going to graduate school. Letters of recommendation we're going to talk about as well in great detail on further lectures. I just want to again talk about that in order to get a good letter of recommendation, it often requires a fair amount of back work. So again, if you're in a situation where you're your senior year and you're wondering to yourself, who should you get letters of recommendation for? Let me just briefly touch on this. Ideally, they should be professors. And ideally, they should be professors from your field or specifically the field you're applying to graduate programs in. So for instance, if you were applying to clinical programs, you would ideally want psychology professors that are specialized in clinical psychology. If you were going on to a social psych graduate program, you would want letters of recommendation, ideally from psychology faculty members, professors that are specialized in social psychology. But honestly, the best letters of recommendation come from professors that have had you in multiple classes and you have also worked with in some other form, whether you've worked in their research lab, served as undergraduate teaching assistant, or potentially worked with them in various psychological organizations or psych clubs. You want to make sure that you've had some non-class experiences, and the more relevant to your graduate career and your eventual career, the better. So if you can find an undergraduate internship in, for example, human resources management, if you're planning to go to graduate school in industrial organizational psychology, that's a worthwhile non-class experience. If you're interested in working with people with PTSD, if you can volunteer at an organization that works with people that have PTSD, that again is a great non-class experience. Professional affiliations are also worth at least addressing briefly. If there is a national or international organization that is tied to your field of interest, it's not a bad idea to join it as an undergraduate. Again, it's a small thing, but it communicates that you are already thinking as a professional. And finally, if you have the opportunity through the work of research labs as an undergraduate to get any type of undergraduate presentations or publications, these of course also look very positive on your applications and are more important if you're looking at PhD programs. So let's look at that GPA. So this is an average across APA programs. And basically this is a mathematical average. If we look at the required psych GPA, master's programs on average expect you to have at least a B in psych classes. And doctoral programs slightly higher than a B, 3.17 on a 4-point scale. The required overall GPA is generally, again, across the board, and these are means. That means some programs require more, some programs require less. But these are programs listed in the APA Guide to Graduate Programs. Again, master's programs basically wants to see at least that 3.0 or approximately a 3.0 average, and again, doctoral programs somewhat lower. Now, these are minimum requirements. The median overall GPA of accepted students And median, remember, is less susceptible to skewness. So basically, those numbers we see in the first two columns, notice they're lower. And the reason they're lower is there's some programs that may not have a requirement or may have a C requirement. But very few programs truly require that. And that's why we're reporting median when we look at the accepted students. Again, for master's programs, average across all master's programs, typically what we're seeing is that their GPA is going to be 3.37 overall. For doctoral programs, 3.54. And if we look at their psych-specific GPA, about a 3.5 for master's programs, a 3.63. So generally speaking, obviously, the higher your GPA, the better. But if your GPA is 3.0 or above, it's not necessarily a stop sign to applying to graduate programs. If it's a 3.5 or higher, you're in decent shape. And obviously, the closer you get to 4.0, the better. If your GPA, though, is below a 3.0, you have a problem. That doesn't mean you can't apply to graduate school. Just recognize that you're going to have to basically, you have to convince them why they should be looking at your application when your GPA is at the very bottom end of what is normally acceptable to get into graduate school. I can tell you in my own case, I was not the best undergraduate student. I took a lot of classes I wasn't interested in. I also changed majors a couple of times, and each time I changed major, it was usually because I had lost interest and didn't do well in those classes. Which meant that when I decided to apply to graduate school originally, and at that time I had no intention of even becoming a professor, I actually ended up going back to school for an entire year, 24 credit hours, to basically show the kind of student that I now was. And my goal was to get a 4.0 in those 24 credit hours because I knew I had to basically make an argument. Don't look at my overall GPA, look at what I am doing now. So again, it's not that you can't move forward, but generally speaking, I would say a 3.0 to a 3.5 GPA, you're in the yellow to green zone. 3.5 and above, you're in the green zone. If you're below a 3.0, you're kind of in the red zone, and it's something that you're either going to need to address or really be careful about the programs you're applying to. Now let's talk about the GRE. So 80% of master's programs and 97% of doctoral programs require the GRE general test. And again, I kind of mentioned that generally speaking, be at least cautious of a program that does not require the GRE. Now there's two broad areas. Actually, there's three. There's a writing section, but I'll honestly tell you, very few graduate programs pay much attention to that writing score unless it is very low. So generally speaking, you don't get a benefit from doing well on the writing. You just get a penalty if you do poorly. Excuse me. So for verbal reasoning, again, we're looking at the median score for admission to master's programs and the median score for admission to doctoral programs. And we see they're not that different because this is actually on a fairly small scale, relatively speaking. So for master's programs, we're going to see about a 154 in verbal and a 150 in quant for approximately a score of 304. For graduate programs or PhD programs, we're going to see a 158 in verbal and a 154 in quantitative. And again, this is the average. What that basically means is, again, let's talk about bands. If you're applying to a master's program and you've got a GRE of 290 or above, you're probably not having to worry about your GRE. Obviously, you're kind of wanting a 300 or above. There's just kind of a psychological factor of having that 300 or above, and that's probably meaning that you're not even having to worry about GRE anymore. But I wouldn't worry too much about your GRE in a master's program unless you're below a 290. Below a 290, I would almost suggest you retake it, see if you do better. Or again, you need to address why a graduate program should not be paying attention to that low score. Because what the GRE is made to do is basically measure your ability to learn and your ability to adapt, which are both important for graduate programs. If you're interested in a PhD or doctoral program, you're probably needing to see a 310 or up to a 315 or higher before you're really happy with that score. Now again, that doesn't mean people with lower GREs don't get into graduate programs. They often do. However, it is less likely. So again, the magic number for your GRE to be just pretty much happy with it if you're applying to a master's program is 300 plus, and probably for a PhD somewhere near 310 or 315. So again, let's take a look at various things that we can talk about as far as our GPA and transcripts. So for example, if we have low grades, mostly C's, 2.0 GPA, you got a lot of work to do. You either have to show that you are a different student in advanced classes or recently. In other words, there was an event that caused that GPA. You may have to go back for a semester or 2 semesters and repair that damage if graduate school is really important to you. Or you need to show the classes that matter you did well in. If you have low grades in methods classes, methods and stats, almost all graduate programs are going to have some component of a graduate statistics class and methods class. I would suggest considering retaking those to show that you did better now that you've decided graduate school's in your future. What you don't want to show is declining performance, that you actually, so if you have a GPA, for example, of 3.0, it's not just the GPA. They are going to look at those transcripts. And if they find that most of your A's were in 100 and 200 level classes, you mainly got B's in 300 level classes, and you got C's in 400 level classes, that's not a student that's likely to get into graduate school, because what you're showing is the harder the classes got, the worse you did. What you're wanting to show is the reverse. If you don't have a perfect GPA, you want to show that you got better as you started to take the actual subject classes of which you're interested in. Also notice that if you take multiple withdrawals, those will show up on your transcripts as well, and this can also communicate a poor picture. So again, when we're going over these slides, some of this information is going to be about how you present information, and if you're actually taking this early enough to where you're still in the process of going through your undergraduate career, definitely keep this in mind. So if you're a sophomore or junior, you need to do better as you go through undergraduate, and make sure that you're showing that improving in performance. It makes a better argument for graduate school. So remember, you can repeat core classes. In your personal statement, if there was a particular semester that caused that low GPA and it is not indicative of your typical performance, you can address that. And again, think about, does your psych-specific GPA tell a better story, and do your last 2 years tell us a better story? So if you have a less than stellar GPA, you need to address it in one of these ways: repeating core classes, describing why the GPA isn't quite where you need it, and doing it in a very convincing way, or repairing the damage. So who's going to grad school? Just recognize that also above and beyond GRE, GPA, and letters, every year it's slightly different as far as how many people are applying to graduate school. It actually tends to fluctuate with the unemployment rate. So the better the economy is doing, the less people are applying to grad school. And the worse the economy is doing, the more people apply to grad school. So for instance, if you apply during a year where the economy is doing really well and there's not a whole lot of people applying to graduate school, you may actually have a better chance to get into grad school that year than a year later when the economy is not doing as well and there's a lot more people. So again, just kind of think about it, that beyond everything else, it's one of the reasons we can't give you an answer of exactly what GRE or GPA will get you into what program, because it does vary every year depending on the number of people applying to those programs. So let's talk briefly about, just again, your fit and different types of graduate programs in psychology. And you want to make sure that you find the right person-job fit. And we talk a lot about person-job fit in industrial organizational psychology, but that's basically the idea: does the person and the job role or environment they in, do they complement each other? Is there a good fit? And if there is, you're going to see better performance and better satisfaction with the person. So again, are you interested in being a researcher, an academic, a practitioner, and are you in the right program for those goals? What are the setting of the work? What are the day-to-day activities of that particular graduate program? You want to match your graduate education to your career. And again, you also need to see, do I need an APA accredited program? Not all programs in psychology need to be accredited by the APA. But if you're looking at specifically counseling or clinical programs, there's a good chance that actually the internships that you need to take as a part of that education require that your program be accredited. So again, know that ahead of time, and if you do need a program that is APA accredited, make sure you're only applying to programs that are APA accredited. Also recognize there's kind of three different training models that you'll find in graduate programs broadly. There's the research scientist model, and I would call this kind of the traditional academic model. It's made to make researchers an academic. There's a strong focus on empirical research, there's a strong focus on research methodology, and a strong research and statistical knowledge. And the goal of these programs is to turn out scientists, just to turn out researchers. There's also the science practitioner model. A lot of graduate programs are now in this model. It's basically an applied model that basically focuses on both practical experience and research skill. The programs here at SIUE are all in the science practitioner model. We're focused on giving you practical skills. We expect you to actually go on, unlikely to become a researcher, at least with just a master's degree or a scientist, but likely to work in an applied setting where you also will hopefully use the research skills that you learned as well. Now, a newer model, and again, newer is within the last 2 to 3 decades, is the practitioner scholar model, also referred to as the PsyD. And this is the idea that why should you be spending time in your practice and your graduate career learning science when all you're planning to do is become a practitioner? So the focus is more on practice, clinical skills. It often also is programs that allow more part-time schooling, so someone that's already working in the field but wants the additional education. Now again, none of these are right or wrong. It's simply asking which one is the best fit for your model. I will note that the science practitioner model is most found in kind of traditional brick and mortar, non-for-profit and state schools. The PsyD or practitioner specific model is also found in such places, but a lot of for-profit and online for-profit schools offer PsyDs. And again, I would just caution you that if you're going down this route, before you go into one of those programs, find people that are doing the work that you want to do and find out, would a PsyD get you that job? So you may be asking, should I go for a master's versus a doctorate? The advantages of a master's degree, the admission requirements are usually a little bit lower, and some students actually look at master's programs as their safeties. They're applying to master's programs hoping to get into a PhD program, but if they don't, they figure, well, I'll finish a master's, and then once I'm done with the master's, I'll reapply to PhD programs. Typically, they are shorter in time. Typically, a full-time program, like the ones here at SIUE, tend to be 2 years. Some of them are 3 years. Very rarely will you find a master's program that will take you more than 4 years. And a 4 years program will often be a part-time program. And that's another advantage of master's programs. It's more likely to find master's programs that are part-time or evenings only or even online. The disadvantages, you typically will enter the work market at a lower pay grade compared to someone that finishes a PhD. In most fields, you can't actually call yourself a psychologist with just a master's degree. If you do go the master's route first and then move on to a PhD, recognize that your thesis and your credits from the master's program may help you get into that PhD program, but depending on what the master's program was and where it's from and the PhD program you're applying to, you may not get to transfer all of your classes or even your thesis. In other words, you may have to retake some classes and you may even have to do a second thesis. Generally speaking, if you go master's first and then move on to a PhD, broadly it will take longer than if you just got straight into a PhD program. Now again, before I talk about PhD and its advantages and disadvantages, remember that the biggest thing you can do, the best thing you can do, is find someone that's doing the work you want to do and find out what degree it took to get there. And if they tell you all you need is a master's degree, that tells you master's degree is probably the way to go. If they tell you it is very rare that I see anyone with a master's degree working in this field, you need a PhD, listen to them. Do your homework, find out what you're wanting to do, and then get the education that gets you there. So looking at the PhD versus the PsyD, and again, remember that these are both of these are 4+ year programs. Both of them are effectively trying to get you to become a psychologist. But I do think it's worth taking a look at kind of where the people end up that get a PhD versus a PsyD. So notice in university settings, approximately just slightly over 10% have PsyDs. So that means almost 90% have PhDs. That tells you right there, if you're wanting to go into academics, you're probably wanting to look at the PhD. And we see this again in four-year colleges, we see it in medical schools, and we even see it in kind of research institutes and academic settings. Now, if we're looking at educational settings, so not higher education, but working in schools, we see about an even split. And as we go to independent practice, hospital, human services, managed care, we tend to see the PsyDs actually more populous than the PhDs. And a lot of times I do want to caution you that the data that you're seeing here often is people that are already doing the work in independent practice, hospitals, human services, and then go part-time into a PsyD program to get the degree to match what they're doing. If you actually look at entry-level jobs, we would see the PhDs are still more likely to be hired at an entry level. So again, just things to consider as you're deciding what program is right for you. So the level of debt, though, by type of degree, and again, this is PhD versus PsyD, notice how this chart plays out, that most PhD programs are at brick and mortar institutes, are full-time programs, and the vast majority of them include funding. They include assistantships and they include tuition waivers, which means that if we also look at how much debt you leave college with, you're going to notice that there's a distinct difference here as well. PhDs are cheaper overall on average. PsyDs are often very expensive. Most programs that offer PsyDs do not provide financial assistance, they do not provide assistantships, they do not provide tuition waivers. They're often for-profit schools, which means that that profit is having to come somewhere. So just recognize that as well as you're trying to decide which program is right for you. And how do you do this? Again, I can't stress enough, do your research. You are preparing to decide on basically a decision that's going to last 2 to 5 years of your life of advanced education, which will hopefully then lead you to a career that you want. And you should be thinking about, what do I want to do? Why am I doing this additional education? What is my end goal? And the best way to find out the education you need to get to the end goal that you want to go to is to do research. Psychology is a science based on research, quantitative and qualitative. So apply this to your choice of specialization in psychology, your career goals, and your choice of graduate school. Do your research, ask questions, gather information. But that's the most important research project you'll ever do. So gather as much data as you can, talk to as many people as you can to decide what actually serves you best and is going to actually be the answer that gets you to the career that you want.